I will join the chair in saying we're very pleased that Dr. Scott was willing to spend some time at ODI on his, as part of his London tour. One of the things we try to do at ODI is to sort of link up the perspective of practical politicians, practical policy people, with perspectives coming from research. So I'm going to use just a small amount of time to elaborate a little bit on that comment from Dr. Scott that this is not just a Zambian problem. But I think, I mean, my region of reference is sub-Saharan Africa. And what I want to say is that in the Africa Power and Politics program, the program that I coordinate, we're moving towards some broad conclusions about the kinds of economic challenges that Zambia-type countries are facing and the kind of political challenges that are linked to that. A phrase which we're increasingly feeling it necessary to use is the historian's phrase, path dependency. The idea that unless something radical happens, countries tend to reproduce regularly the same sort of pattern. And for a range, I'm not going to talk about Zambia at all. Let me say across a range of other sub-Saharan African countries, we find very strong path dependency, both in the economic sphere and in the political sphere. In the economic sphere, one of the things that we observe, even among the countries currently doing best, is that they recover a reasonably impressive rate of economic growth, but the structural problems of the economy remain exactly as they were in the past. And I mean, just on the face of it, you do seem to face a challenge in Zambia that in a period of success, you are actually reproducing the same structural problems which are already visible in the Kaunda period. Politically, there are patterns which I saw very neatly explained in particular reference to Malawi recently by very senior Malawian observers, where we have alternation of parties in power. There's a bit of a pattern in many countries that the first term is a period in which the new political forces gain a lot of credit for sorting out the mess that the last lot left behind, stamping down on corruption, but also sorting out other kinds of messes. But then in the second term, the new guys revert back to the pattern of the old guys and leave a mess that has to be sorted out by the next lot. I mean, I'm not sure how general that is, but it was very convincingly applied to the analysis of the last two presidents of Malawi. Why are we getting these patterns? First thing, and this is a very sort of elementary point about development economics, to achieve structural change and not just fast economic growth requires a major effort and requires an effective interventionist state. Politically, the kind of systems we have in place in most of the countries make it extraordinarily difficult for incumbent governments to make that kind of big interventionist effort to change the structure of the economy, to get smallholder agriculture, to begin to improve its productivity and that sort of thing. The political incentives in place are very much geared to doing what is necessary to win the next election. And taking on the big challenges of economic transformation is not a safe and easy route to winning the next election. Quite the contrary. It's risky. So in short, I mean, we have a major sort of tension between what are the big economic transformation challenges on the one hand and the nature of politics. So I'm convinced that this is an interesting and hopeful moment for Zambia, but I would put on the table the possibility that you too are going to face these difficulties, that the political system generates an incentive to be very short-termist, that the big transformation challenges involve risks and slow payoff interventions. And this is going to be one of the main themes of our final research on the research program. And I think, I mean, those in the global community who sort of care about the future of Africa need to be engaging with this question and engaging in discussion with African leaders about how exactly we're going to get around this conflict between the politics and the real economic challenges. And the aid business needs to be more mindful of making a positive contribution to this, and I don't see at the moment anybody in the aid business centrally focusing on how this is a phrase that some people find humorous, but I think it's quite serious actually. How we can help to make African democracy safe for development, safe for economic transformation. So there's a big, broad challenge about the region, which I think marries up in some ways with the particular challenges in Zambia. And that's, I think, enough for me. So.
That's extremely interesting. You should only stay for one term. Do it fast and get out, I suppose.
I made that joke the other day and nearly got slaughtered. So,
well, let's just open it up a bit.
Which underlines what he's been saying.
David, did you this thing about disconnecting the immediate reward from the voting? One of the points that the Vice President made is something. Does that have resonance for you?
Say that again.
Disconnecting the immediate reward from voting behaviour. In other words, you might get the bicycle or the short-term.
Oh yes.
But actually, and there's a history of, if you like, patronage politics in some countries in Africa, and how do you break that?
Yes, I mean, well, you might say, well, African democracies are deepening and voters are beginning to look to things a bit beyond than the bar of soap which comes out on election day. But that, I think, is a long, slow process, and the evidence is, I think, that the politicians will not find it easy to accept that they can win the next election on the basis of implementing a sort of medium-term transformation plan. It's difficult to make that credible to voters, and the politicians themselves are not persuaded by it in most countries.
Would you like to comment on this idea that actually the big transitions are really difficult and politically very risky?
Yes, I mean, I think the classic, I mean, the example which comes and goes in everywhere, Malawi, Zambia, and so forth, concerns the subsidization of smallholder agriculture, which is a vote-buying tactic as much as anything else, where you give away free fertilizer or cheap fertilizer or fertilizer on credit which is never paid back, and then guarantee the price of maize irrespective of where it's grown, and so on and so forth. And that, in the Zambian case at the moment, is costing 15% of the government's budget, which is more than the entire health sector and nearly as much as the education sector. And the perception of many politicians is that you can't afford to do it, can't afford to end it, even though the elections are not for another 4 years. At the same time, it must be said that the claims that it's reaching, I mean, what is interesting is the false claims or the false perception that it's actually reaching the people that it's intended for. I mean, in Zambia, that's certainly not the case. It's getting into all kinds of wrong hands. It's being smuggled out and smuggled in, and people of influence are getting control. And I mean, if ever you needed proof that it doesn't work as a vote buying tactic, just take the last election, because it was as big as it had ever been in September last year, and it didn't work. It didn't change the story. So I think we have to acquire. Maybe it's a matter of acquiring, first of all, accurate insight into what's actually happening with these kind of shell-out subsidy arrangements, because the elite capture is very marked in Zambia anyway, and I'm sure elsewhere. And also whether you shouldn't summon the courage in both hands and say, look, you're having to pay for secondary school education for your children because there's no money. Now what we're going to do is take away with the left hand this form of social subsidization and give it back to you with the right hand on the same day, even, so that you can get your kids educated properly, and we've got a better quality of citizen at the end of the day. It is, but it is difficult. I mean, I know it's difficult because I'm right at the heart of it.
Which makes it seem as though part of the story here is about messaging and the kind of conversation you have with the electorate. Is that a solution that you favour and you find works?
Up to a point. I mean, I think. I mean, as with democracies everywhere, the problem is that there is an alternative team out there, and the more the alternation in power gets institutionalised, the more you have to pay attention to what they're going to offer.
Yes, the downside of winning an election is that the other guys can have you for exactly the same reasons, using exactly the same machinery.